Now we're going to talk a little bit about editing single DNG exposures in night, low light situations. Here we're in Tokyo, and we can see that we have blue hour sky, we have some brightly lit shops, we have people walking around, we have a lot of movement and such. So this is the kind of situation where HDR bracketing, you can get ghosting problems with moving people and moving automobiles. So this is a single exposure. The out of camera JPEG here, right? We can see that this was underexposed by a couple of stops. If we overexpose the JPEG a little bit, we would have lost all the detail in these shops here. Probably could have gotten the white balance a little better, but it would not give us the results that we can get with the single DNG. With the single DNG, we can underexpose a bit. Here it is out of camera. Here it is after some of the settings on the side. What I've done here, let me just snapshot all that. We've boosted the exposure a bit so that we bring up the shadows, right? We have maybe play with the contrast a little bit till it feels just right. Bring down the highlights so we can see more in the brightest areas of the gate and the shops. We can probably put a little bit of a brush on the shop to bring out more of the highlights there. We can adjust the black and white levels if necessary, which aren't so much here. I like to give it a touch of clarity, a touch of saturation. Depending on the image, depending on the light source, you may or may not need more or less saturation. A little bit of sharpening at this point doesn't hurt either. Always make sure that you have turned on chromatic aberration removal in the unstitched images. So those are more or less the basic settings here. There are other things that we could do depending on the image, but this scene was fairly well lit. The only thing I would add here is maybe a brush. These shops are kind of blown out, so we could use the brush with auto mask off. All right, just a little bit of a brush there and bring down the highlights so we can see what's going on there. We could also change the color of that light, which is kind of blue, make it a little bit more warmer, a little bit more pleasant. Adjust, whoops, that's a little bit too much down there, but we can use a bit more brush up here, you know, just to make it look natural to the eye. We can see that compared to the original image, we have more detail in these areas than we did before. If we were using a DSLR, we'd be able to zoom in on every sign and everybody in every shop, but it would take longer to shoot. You can't bring a DSLR rig with you everywhere. This is basically a nice tourist snapshot. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about using the Lightroom brushes here as well. With the Lightroom brush tool, we have several options for control of the brush. We can use the mouse wheel or the slider you see on the side to control the size of the brush. I like to use the mouse wheel. If we hold down the shift key, we control the feather radius, and we can see feather radius larger gives us a larger drop-off area. Feather radius smaller gives us a very hard-edged brush. The brush tool. We have flow and density. I like to keep them both at 100%, and my feather radius about 50% for this demonstration. A single stroke gives me this. If I bring my density down to 50%, a single stroke will be less opaque, and it will give me this, but it will overwrite the density of the previous stroke, making it, in the areas that it intersects, 50%. If I bring my flow down to 50%, and I leave my density at 100%, I can build up cumulative strokes, meaning the more I go over an area, the more opaque it will be. So I can get more of a transition and build it up as I need it to. This will probably make more sense to people familiar with watercolor, painting, etc., which I am not, but that's a quick explanation of the flow and density modes. You can also, of course, erase what you painted by switching to the erase tool or holding down the Alt or Option key. You get the erase tool. With the erase tool, you have the option of flow, but not the option of density. So we can kind of partially erase. Okay, so we're going to talk about differences between editing the DNG and editing a developed TIFF file or JPEG file. Everybody who's familiar with editing DNG in Lightroom, etc., will already be familiar with this. But a DNG file contains much more information than a JPEG or a TIFF. Once you have changed the DNG to a TIFF, you can no longer adjust the white balance in the same way that you could with the DNG file. This is because the white balance and the colors in the DNG file have not actually been determined yet. They need to be set by the raw processing software. Once that's been done, you have a lot less range in what you can do with the image once it's been developed into a TIFF. With the DNG, we can change the white balance in a way that we cannot with the TIFF file. So you always want to set, there are certain things that you always want to do before you develop to TIFF, namely set your white balance properly. In this case, Times Square, we have lights of every possible color flashing all at once. It gets a little crazy. We also want to do what highlight recovery we can in the DNG, as that contains much more dynamic range than the developed TIFF or JPEG. If we look at the JPEG that came alongside this TIFF, we see it has a very purplish tint, which there's only so much we can do to get rid of. And same with shadow recovery. Really only so much, even if we blast the shadows all the way out, which I have to say, this isn't bad for a JPEG, but it still doesn't get close to what we can get from the DNG. That's about as good as we're going to get. After we've developed them in Lightroom, here we're Times Square. This is just a single exposure. We have all kinds of lights going on. Times Square is difficult for bracketing with all of the flashing signs. That's the kind of thing that HDR gets a little bit confused. But stitching is really easy. You have to configure the Theta Z1 as a preset, right? Then you just call that preset from the DNG that you've applied your settings to. It will create a copy of the DNG as a TIFF, which it will now stitch. And you then bring it into the stitcher, right? We basically, only thing we want to do is we want to turn off camera visibility reduction. We only want to use that if you're holding the camera in your fingers. We might want to adjust the center of the image a little bit. Whoops. It would be good if I could drag the image to do this. We can adjust the center of the image a little bit to get it just where we want. Right there, looks good enough. We're going to click OK. We've turned off camera visibility reduction. In this case, the stitching method automatic works fine. If it doesn't, we might want to play with the manual stitching settings. And we can see here with the wrong stitching settings, we're getting a bit of ghosting along the seams. We want to avoid that when we can. But automatic generally does a good job. The only time the automatic stitching gets confused, in my own experience, is when you have objects at greatly different distances. If I had a wall 2 feet away from me on one side of the camera where it's stitching, and I had a wall 20 feet away from me on the other side of the camera, it would give me strange results. But here, everything is, more than 10 feet away, so I'm not getting problems like that. Once you're satisfied with your settings, you just click OK. So after we've exported the image, right after we've stitched the image, this is what it just gave me from the stitcher. We bring it back. I bring it back into Lightroom and I give it another go. See if we can get a little bit more out of the highlights. Single exposure, Times Square. Got about all I could here already. Give it a little bit more clarity, can make it nice. Saturation looks fine as it is. One thing that usually can be improved is to give it a bit more sharpness. So many people use Topaz or other tools. I've always been happy with the Lightroom sharpening tools. In this case, right, I'm giving it about 40%. If you hold down the Option or Alt key while you're moving sharpening, if you bring it all the way up to 150%, you can see what's happening. We're getting too much increase in noise. Exactly. So we'll back it off until we're just right on the edge. We're getting some sharpness, but not too much noise. In this case, seems to be about 40%. The radius setting, if we bring that all the way up, we see what happens also. Bringing these things all the way up and all the way down, you can kind of see, but generally speaking, somewhere around 1.1, 1.2 is fine. Detail, also, you see we're starting to get detail back in the noise there, so not too much. Masking, what masking does, again, we're holding down the Option key. The dark areas will not have any sharpening applied to them. So it will only sharpen areas that are shown as white with this preview. That lets us bring up detail in the important areas without bringing up too much noise in the other areas. Compared to where I just started there, we have noticeably increased the sharpness all throughout the image in a meaningful way. If we have any areas that have too much noise, right? A little bit of noise. So, well, hold on. Before we do that, let's actually use the regular noise reduction. Right? Again, holding down the Option key. Bring up the noise tool a little bit. Give it a little bit more sharpness. But I can tell this girl here has too much noise compared to other areas. So what I do for her, these ladies, whoops. Let's bring our flow back to 100%. Just give them a little bit of brushing. Where we see the noise, hide the brush tool, and go down to noise slider. In the brush tool, bring that up a bit, and we have a much more pleasing image right here without all the graininess. A little bit more, boom. This kind of scene, people moving around at night, it's okay if they're a little bit blurry because that's, kind of what you get with a normal camera. And this will work with the HDR plugin, as well. Here, this is a very brightly lit scene, so I'm kind of cheating a bit. But anywhere you see too much noise, yes, I add sharpness to both the DNG file, whether it's a single exposure or an HDR-DNG, and to the stitched panorama. How much sharpness I add really depends on the image, the exposure, how much noise I need to take away, etc. But in almost all cases, you will get the best results by giving it this two-pass effect. So now we're going to talk a little bit about using the brush tools to do what's called a window pull in real estate photography. Here we have an HDR-DNG file that I've already applied some settings to bring most of the room into shape, but we can see the windows are still overexposed. We have brought the highlights down a bit. We have the exposure up to +6. I already pulled 6 stops here. We can bring it more if we, wanted, or bring it less to see, somewhere we're going to want the windows somewhere like that, maybe, which is 3 stops under our main exposure for the image. So once we brought most of the room into shape and we want to mask the windows, there's a number of ways we can do it. We can use a luminance range tool. We can use a brush tool. Here, I'm just going to use the brush tool. I'm going to get the window, where I want to see it, probably about 50% size. I'm going to make sure my auto mask is unselected, and I'm just going to paint over the window here. I find that if you try to mask every window pane divider perfectly, it can be incredibly time consuming, and you end up with a lot of fringing. You can end up with unpleasant fringing. So sometimes it's easier just to leave them dark. But we're going to hide our mask tool overlay for a second. We're going to bring down the exposure of our windows. Two stops. We're going to make it a little warmer so the color feels more in line with the rest of the room. I'm going to give it a little touch of purple because it felt a little greenish to me. Now it's starting to look okay. We now have an overlay that we can see here. We can also use our white on black overlay mode to see that it's a little sloppy and we need to do a little bit of filling in there, density wise. We're going to switch that back to color overlay mode. Now we want to get rid of the edges. So we're going to switch to the eraser tool. You can see, hold down the option key and the plus becomes a minus. Switch to the eraser tool and use that. Whoops. No. Use the eraser tool to clean up some of the edges of our mask here. It can be helpful to show the overlay at this point, so we can get a better idea of exactly where the tool, where we're getting rid of the flow. This is one of the problems of changing the flow settings, is you forget to change them back. Getting good window, it depends on the interior. I mean, if you have a window that has a view that has light coming in, then you're probably going to want to improve the appearance in this way. Whoops. Now, here I'm going to also, here we're going to switch to the auto mask mode, and we're going to do what we can to get rid of, whoops, very carefully. But in some cases, we might find that using the eraser and a lower flow, all right? So instead of giving me 100% with one stroke, it gives me 50% and then 50% on the next, helps you kind of, you know, massage it into place. We can also see that in this area here, we're starting to get a lot of noise in the recovery. That's partially due to the proximity of the light areas versus the bright areas. To get each one of these teeny little panes, window dividers, all right, that's a lot of work. In any case, though, you see that this took me, you know, barely a couple of minutes and it looks pretty good. We can give it another brush. We want another brush because, hey, look how noisy it is. We don't want that, right? Whoops. Are we all set right? Yeah, we're all set right. So there we could set another brush where we could get rid of the noise if we wanted. And I believe you mentioned fringing in some, here's some more noise there. Let's get rid of that noise. Whoops. Now there we see we have a fringing kind of issue, so we probably want to go back and paint the brush. Whoops, wrong brush. Want to go back and paint that a little bit. And, you know, just sort of massage it into place. Again, the flow and the density and the masking can all make this easier. It takes a bit of experimentation. Whoops. Takes a bit of experimentation to figure out what works best for a lot of different situations. Here we also have color cast issues. We have blue daylight, cool blue daylight, probably around 5000K, coming into a room that's lit by 2700, 3000K warmish incandescent colored lights. So, and we also have the area in between them where it gets very difficult. There's a number of ways that this can be corrected. One, you can use And it's always better to do this if you can in the DNG file, but if an area goes between the two fisheye images, it can be difficult to correct. Here we have most of the yellow light in that area there, but it starts to get mixed along the edge there. We have some yellow here, a little bit of yellow there, some yellow up here. But for now, just to deal with the yellow here, a couple of things we can do. One, we can make a new mask. We make a new brush. We just give it big, wide brush. Auto mask is off. We put it where we see the warmish yellowish color. And then we just give it a little bit of a cool it down a little bit in the white balance. We can also, this is where the flow can become very handy, because we can, just put it in gently as we need it. Just a little bit, not blah, 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 pour it all in at once. There are other ways of dealing with this as well, and which ones work the best might depend on your image. But if we didn't do that, we also have the option of doing a targeted saturation adjustment. If we go into the HSL, which stands for Hue, Saturation, and Lightness, or color panel, we go to HSL. If we go to the color panel, you see we have all our colors: red, orange, yellow, hue, saturation, and lightness. For the sake of quick demonstration, red saturation makes the reds more saturated or less. We can also make the reds a slightly different red, make them more orange, make them more magenta. We can also make them brighter or darker. And we do that across the entire image. When we go to the hue, saturation, lightness, we can just change the saturation or the luminance or the hue all in one area here. But there's another important difference. The targeted adjustment tool, right? The targeted adjustment tool, we go into saturation, we click on the targeted adjustment tool, and here's an area that's too orange or something. If we click on that area and drag down, boom, orange goes away, right? And we can see here, it compensated with the yellow and orange. But the problem is, it gets rid of all the yellow in the entire image. If you were to look at this and decide, okay, it looks too orange, you don't necessarily, okay, I'll play with the orange, but is that doing it? We've just sucked all the orange out of the image. You might not notice right away, but it's probably going to do something weird to, right? Like that wooden object over here. The hue saturation tool lets you pick, the targeted adjustment tool lets you pick what color a certain area is automatically, right? I could decide, I want to desaturate the reds or give it more green. Let's give this whole image more saturation to start with, right? And then go back to the hue saturation tool. And we can use it to, pull all of the, orange out of here, but it will, it can give you a good result in some areas, but it can have unpredictable results as well, in that it will pull orange out of areas that you don't necessarily want it pulled out of, like that wooden, small wooden sculpture. Plants, probably another good example. These stems, the wooden table. This bit of wood here. You have to be careful with the targeted adjustment tool. When you use the brush tools, it's much easier to control what you're doing. But the targeted adjustment tool is another good choice for dealing with white balance mismatches. In general, it can be easier to correct white balance in the final image. Okay. And this is the image that I just developed, that we were just playing with developing. It's been stitched. It's not perfect. It could still use a bit more work. I could have spent a bit more time in the post. But here we're going to give this another round of settings. We're going to bring the highlights down a bit. We're going to bring the clarity up a little bit. We're going to maybe bring the exposure up. We're going to bring the shadows up. We're going to bring the saturation up a bit too. We're going to try to bring the white balance of the walls in line a bit. Now, there's a number of ways to do this, but I like to use the brush. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, make sure that our brush flow is set at 100%. We're going to make sure we're in color overlay mode. We're going to choose, for this particular ceiling, we're going to choose auto mask because we don't want to hit those red areas, and we're hoping this will avoid that. It should also avoid the light fixtures. We're going to paint the white part of the ceiling. And this area here. Get the blue part of the wall over there. We want to avoid anything like a poster or a sign that has colors in it, because we don't want to desaturate those. Anyway, once we've selected our walls that we want to appear white, right? Again, quick and dirty. We're just going to mask them, as I just said, and desaturate them. Hit them with the desaturation. All right, that will eat up all of, and how much desaturation? You don't want to use too much because it looks unnatural. You don't want, if you bring the saturation up to 100%, you can see, okay, there's a lot of yellow here that we really don't want. We can even compensate that a bit by making it a bit bluer. Try to make it as neutral as we can before desaturating. And, desaturate as little as possible without, underdoing it. I find somewhere -20 usually works okay. We've still left some color in these lights just to show that everything isn't totally, dead and depressing. This area over here still looks a little bit blue. This area over there still looks a little bit off. We could apply a second mask to these areas if we want to get those colors a little better. That's a little blue over by the window. Let's just give that whole area a slightly warmer feeling, right? We also have a little bit of a gloomy spot right here by the air conditioner, which doesn't matter, but looks a little dark. So let's, turn off auto mask. You can bring up the shadows there just to prevent it from looking a little gloomy. It's still a little yellow. We can bring down the blue, and we can also add that to our masked area. That's a general idea. This is not a perfect demonstration, quick and dirty, but these are the kind of things that you can do to get rid of color casts. Okay, so everybody who's new to the Z1, couple other tips. Keep your lenses clean. Use a soft lens cloth to make sure that there are no fingerprints, no dust, no smears on your lenses. Always use a sturdy tripod so your camera does not fall over. Don't complain about lack of lens protectors because they would reduce image quality. Keep your battery charged. It's easy enough to have a small USB power bank in your bag that will keep, it's easy, gotta get rid of that number 2. It's easy enough to have a small USB power bank in your bag that will keep your camera fully charged at all times, saves you on disposable internal batteries that are gonna cost, $40, and you're not gonna need them in 2 or 3 years. Sturdy tripod, I think, is probably my main advice for beginners. A lightweight tripod that will work indoors in some situations is not a great idea to trust your camera outdoors if it's windy, if there are people or pets running around. A small, lightweight selfie stick kind of tripod is really only useful for very carefully controlled indoor situations. Otherwise, always use a sturdy support.